Hi guys. So now we'll have a look at the overall analysis of IIFT 2021, that is the IIFT test conducted for admissions to the 2021 batch. So after a delay of nearly 2 months, IIFT typically is held on the first Sunday of December immediately after CAT. Having been delayed by nearly 45-50 days now, did IIFT throw any surprises? Was it tougher, easier compared to last year or to the other exams? Well, so let's consider all of that today. If we look at today's IIFT test, the unanimous feedback is that it was slightly tougher compared to IIFT 2019, that is the paper just before it. Now, yes, there were variations in each section, with some sections being at par and some being slightly tougher. But the overall feedback was that the overall difficulty seemed slightly higher, and there was a major inconvenience which a lot of students faced, which was with respect to the interface. So the NTA interface involved a lot of horizontal and vertical scrolling for group questions, especially with a lot of data. And considering an exam like IIFT, which has large data sets, humongous tables, 2-3 graphs, etc., or long RCs, it becomes a speed breaker all by itself. So that itself adds a bit of a challenge. Now, what was the overall structure of the test? So I would say same as last year, which means that we were looking at 4 sections where VA and RC were combined. Yes, within VA RC, all the passages were together. The VA questions were together. Similarly, in DI and LR, the DI sets were first and together, followed by the RC. So technically, they were like 2 subsections in one section, but they were not named that way. So what was the breakup? VA RC, 35 questions, 16 of RC, 19 of VA. Then followed by DI-LR, 16 of DI, 14 of LR, followed by Quant, 25 questions, and GK and Current Affairs, 20 questions. So that was a total of 110 questions, 35, 30, that's 65, 25, so 90, and 20, that's 110. What were the total marks? So since this is being conducted by the NTA, which also conducts CMAT, expect a lot of marks per question. So just like CMAT has 4 marks per question, here you had +3 -1 as your marking scheme. But this is a typical IIFT trait, this was part of the marking only for VARC, DILR and Quant. So GK had 1.5 and -0.5. That's half the marks there. So that was the overall structure. Now, how did the test go? So let's start off with the first section, which was seen at least in my paper, which was Quant. I would say this was by far the toughest section of this particular test. Last year too, the Quant section was on the tough side, but this year I felt it was even tougher compared to last year. Now this was a surprise for me, especially if you consider the fact that out of the 25 questions, nearly 11 to 12 were on arithmetic. So stuff like averages, ratios, time and work, time and distance, mixtures, profit and loss, simple and compound interest, all were covered. But the challenge was that IIFT added a lot of data. There were questions which were 8 line long. So you had to read a lot of data, try to understand the things that were happening. There were questions where time and work and time and distance were combined, or multiple concepts were combined. So that made the overall difficulty and the time consumption within the questions more, which added to the challenge. Apart from arithmetic, which was 11 to 12 questions, nearly half the section, we then had algebra, a bit of numbers here and there, geometry, which was around 5-6 questions, and there were questions on area of the shaded region or area of 5 circles and so on, which were all time consuming, all complicated. So these were tricky. You had questions on heights and distances, that's trigonometry. Then within PNC permutations, very rarely do I see a fundamental principle of counting question, but with a network given. It looked pretty doable, but it had a lot of cases. So overall, if you look at the quant section, I would say that this was a challenge. So for people whose strength is quant, I would say the test would have turned out to be tougher. Because if they went to maximize their marks in quant, they would have lost time in the other sections. And for people who are banking on the other sections, the key would have been to clear the cutoffs for quant. So what should they be? We would expect the cutoffs for quant to lie somewhere around the 10 to 11 mark range. Typically in IIFT, what we see is that the overall cutoffs tend to be way higher than the sum of the individual cutoffs. So there's a saying in English, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So if you take the total of the sectional cutoffs, it will be far less than the overall test cutoff. So that is something you need to keep in mind. So here in quant, what would be the cutoff? I would say around 10. If you have crossed 10, great. What would be good number of attempts? Now again, though there are 3 marks per question, I would say anywhere around 9 to 10 attempts. 10 attempts if you have crossed with an 80 or 90% accuracy, you are very, very safe. Yes, then above that you have to go if you want to maximize your marks in quant. So having looked at quant, we now move on to DILR. Now when we look at DILR, IIFT has always been famous for its long and complex DI sets, which was again the trend this year. So if I look at the 4 sets this year, I had one set on a bar chart and a line graph, which was on sales in 2 different markets or mandis. I found that doable, though it involved a lot of calculations. So you had to arrive at the overall calculations first, and if you did that, then you could have answered the question. Similarly, there was one set which was a tabular set, production of certain goods, consumption and exports, and then related to imports. So again, this was of the type where observation plus calculations were important. And then there was one more set where we had 2 pie charts. So one was, I think, some wastage of goods, and one was goods given as samples. And then there was sales. So 3 parameters, 2 pie charts, 1 table. It looked complicated, but I would say this was potentially one of the easiest. When I say easiest, it is relative. It's not that it was easy per se. So these 3 were the sets that I would have targeted in the exam. There was a 4th set, which was a line plus bar, which was on indices or index basically, which I believe was tough. So when I look at these 3 sets, in all of them, at least in 2 out of 3, I would have had to create 1 table up front, spend 5 minutes or 10 minutes on that. But once I did that, answering the 4 questions were easier. So in DI, I would have selected 10 questions out of these 12. If I consider these 3 sets, even if I skip 1 or 2 questions, I would have looked at 10 questions here and tried to maximize my marks here. If not 10, 2 sets, but do them bang on. Now, one of the things I did in the test, and I always try and do in IIFT, is that when I look at long DI sets, I look at the questions. Are they conditional? Are they direct? Or does having an initial master table help me? If the answer to that question is yes, then I solve that question in the question paper view, or I hide the question palette on the right. So you have a question palette where hiding it disables the question numbers. So once that goes out, your screen widens, which means you can at least avoid the horizontal scrolling. You might not be able to avoid the vertical scrolling, but definitely the horizontal is avoided. So in that sense, I used this trick and it actually helped me in 2 DI sets and 1 LR set, which I'll describe later. But overall, if you ask me, in DI, I would have tried 8 questions. Coming to LR, in LR, what did we have this year? So we had a circular arrangement, which was quite tricky. It had 4 couples with some parameter, which was some IV fluid quantity, and people had to be seated in a circle. Looked pretty doable, but was time consuming. However, if you did that properly, you would have got all 4 questions right. So I did attempt it, and I would recommend that that should have been attempted. There was another set of 4 questions which was based on tournaments, standard knockout tournaments, seeding and getting rid of one person in each round. Yes, there were a few variations introduced later. This was definitely on the tougher side, and because this was conditional, a lot of you may have skipped it, which might have been the right decision to take in IFT. Apart from these 8 questions, what were the other 6 questions? So you had 2 questions based on scheduling, where you had 4 people working in shifts. Though this was tricky, you could have manually worked it out and got your answer if you were running out of attempts. So I would have attempted that as well. And finally, moving to the 4 single questions, you had one on simple linear arrangements, very easy. One on sentence coding, very easy. One on numerical logic, where novels were given and borrowed, etc., which was slightly tricky. But again, if you put in 2-3 minutes and did it meticulously, you looked at what the question wanted, it could have been attempted. So overall, when I look at the DI and LR section, I would say 2 sets in DI, 2.5 at the best, and anywhere around, say, out of the 14 questions, 8 to 9 questions in LR would actually have been a good performance. Now, what would be the cutoff here? Typically, the DILR cutoff is higher than the quant cutoff because of the groups. So this year, though, I still expect the cutoffs to go down slightly compared to last year. So I would say 20, just as we said 10 for quant. I would say 20 would be a reasonably good number as far as DI is concerned. DI-LR together. What would be good attempts? In my opinion, anything above 15 would be damn good in DI-LR. Coming to the third, VARC section. Now here again, the standard pattern followed, which is 4 sets of RC, followed by that 16 questions, followed by 19 questions of VA. So, how was this section? When we look at the VA section or the RC first, IFT RCs always tend to be long, which was the trend this year as well. However, this year there was an additional challenge, in fact 2 challenges here. One, that they were tricky, especially 2 of them. So the ones that I found reasonably readable or doable, one definitely on plastics, use of plastics and its correlation with the environment. And then there was one on the impact of herd mentality, which was tougher, but still I found it okayish. There were 2 other passages which were on the tougher side. However, at a bare minimum, each of these RCs involved 600 to 700 words at a bare minimum, which takes a lot of time. So if I were a student, I would say attempt only 2 of these, pick 2 RCs and try them, leave the other 2. Rather try and focus on the remaining 19 questions. Now, what were those questions? So in the verbal section, if you check, you had a very heavy emphasis on vocabulary. Out of the 19 questions, I would say nearly 2/3, so 12 questions approximately, were vocab based, with another 4 odd questions being grammar, and then 2 to 3 questions on para-jumbles. So I did not find any fill in the blanks, no close passages, no critical reasoning, no mark the error in the paper at all. What did we have in verbal reasoning? So we had para-jumbles, I think 3 questions, and they weren't absolute sitters, they were quite moderate, so you had to be careful there. What did we have in grammar? You had, I think, 3 questions which were based on correct and incorrect sentences. So 2 sentences written in 4 different ways, identify a combination. And this time, what a lot of us have missed telling you is, in the test, what they did was, you had a question, then you had 4 combinations written, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the options had radio buttons with only 1, 2, 3, 4 written. So it wasn't that you had to, you saw combination statement 2 and 4 in front of option 1 and you directly marked it. No. You had to first evaluate it, understand where it was in the statement order, then find it in the options. With the scrolling, which was already a nuisance, this turned out to be a bigger issue. So here people would have gone wrong. They might not realize it now, but that might happen when the marks come out. So in verbal, 3 questions here which were based on correct and incorrect sentences, and 2 questions based on punctuation. So here your knowledge of grammar was tested. Where is the question mark wrongly inserted, or where is it redundant? So you need to know how question marks function. Then a lot of questions on vocabulary. So IIFT typically has this standard crossword that they put in, 5-6 words missing, and then you'll have 15-20 words given, and based on the meaning you need to put those words there. This is tricky. What they also did this year was that this crossword was scattered throughout the section. So I had the crossword with one question right at the beginning, say question number 18 or so. Then one was question 25, one was question 30. So you needed to be careful there. Then you had those typical match the column questions which are based on word and meaning. I saw something new this year which was based on roots of words. So for example, the word SOMN, somn, means sleep. It is used in words like somnolent, somnambulist, and so on. So there were 3 such questions as well. So if you look at IIFT, your reading ability, your knowledge of vocabulary was tested to a large extent as is expected here. What would be the cutoff year? Now obviously because this section has the maximum questions, the cutoffs tend to be highest. If I look at this section, I would say anywhere around 30-31 should be the cutoff for verbal. In terms of attempts, I would look at 8 attempts for RC and anywhere close to 12 to 13 attempts for VA at a bare minimum. For somebody who's well read, who has a good grasp on vocabulary, you can definitely go higher. Lastly, coming to the GK section. So GK was a mixed bag. I found it slightly, or I would say more or less at par compared to last year. Around a half and half split between GK and current affairs. Questions distributed across areas. So you had people, you had brands, you had geography, all of it. So when I look at GK, I would say just select 10 questions that you are good at and answer them well. Here, a score of anywhere between 4 and 5 should be good to clear the cutoff. So if I have to summarize overall, and yeah, of course, like every year, GK again had 3 match the column questions, which is something that is always there in IIFT. I think there were 3 or 4 of them. And if you are well read, these are the ones that I always target, because if you eliminate one case, if you say A on the left side matches with 4 on the right, then you can eliminate options, you get your marks faster. So on the whole, if I look at this paper, what do I expect the overall cutoffs to be? So I would say quant, I'll just repeat, quant 10, DILR 20 to 21, verbal 30 to 31, and GK is somewhere around 4 to 5. The overall cutoff I would expect in the low 120s. So initial reports suggested that it would be around 125-ish. But a lot of students have come back saying that they did struggle with attempts. So I would say somewhere between 122 and 125 seems more likely right now. Of course, this might get revised as and when we get more data. So this is all about IIFT 2020 as it happened. I would suggest that as a student, please do not cry over spilt milk now, as in what has happened has happened. You might have had a great paper, in which case we just wait for the results. You might not have had an excellent test or something that you expected, in which case if you are looking at TIS, CMAT or MHCT, you should start your preparation for that in full swing. In case you have your other calls through CAT and now potentially through ZAT, SNAP, NMAT, etc., start preparing for these. So the exam is done, you've done your best, now just hope for the best result. Thank you and wish you all the very best.